Okay, I just want to start off with a little disclaimer that the talk today, there we go, that the talk today will include some information from a collection of documents and images that were donated to the museum, but were compiled by a man named John Bluth. So he was a researcher in the process of writing a book on Brooks's life. The talk will also include images and research from the Henry Ford Museum, and of course, research of my own. If at the end of the talk you wish to know more about Harry Brooks, the collection is available at the museum and can be accessed by appointment. All right. So you might have heard of American aviators such as the Wright brothers, Amelia Earhart, Charles Lindbergh. But what about Birmingham's very own pilot who flew during the golden age of aviation? This is the story of Harry Brooks. Now, Harry Brooks was born on December 2nd, 1902, just 2 months before his contemporary Charles Lindbergh. Growing up on his family's farm in Southfield, Brooks' dreams were always in the clouds. According to Bluth's research, his sister Blanche recounted how, after witnessing a Wright airplane demonstration at the State Fair around 1911, Harry was bitten by the aviation bug. Brooks began his freshman year at Birmingham's Baldwin High School in 1917. Let me go back to this one actually. This was 3 years after the start of the First World War, and not long after the US entered the conflict in April of the same year. The war pressured and incentivized countries involved to advance their aircraft technology and capability, and late involvement in the conflict meant that the US needed to move quickly to advance its aircraft production to compete. Therefore, in August of 1917, Congress passed a $640 million aviation bill with little to no debate for the upbuilding of military air service and for the aircraft production. By May 15th, 1918, just 6 months before the end of the war, the first American scheduled airmail flight successfully took to the skies, and a Curtiss Jenny aircraft, which forever changed the postal service and the airline industry. During the war, Detroit also became the center of U.S. warplane production, as the Fisher Body Company was awarded a contract by the government to build fighter planes. The technological advancements made in Detroit certainly had an influence on aspiring aviators such as Brooks. According to Bluth's research, Brooks and a few of his schoolmates attempted to build their own airplane in the basement of Baldwin High School, although it never saw the light of day. In 1921, as Brooks entered into his senior year, the country was facing yet another unprecedented time, the Roaring Twenties, which was an era of economic prosperity, cultural shifts, and optimism. Detroit was also growing rapidly during this time as its population skyrocketed, thanks to employment opportunities in the auto industry. And by this time, Brooks evolved into somewhat of a dashing figure. He was voted the most handsome boy in the Baldwinian yearbook. He also served as captain of the varsity football team, and the yearbook prophesied he would become a Southfield airplane manufacturer. However, once his high school days came to a close, Brooks chose not to farm as his father would have liked, and instead drove buses in Royal Oak, while also contemplating attending the University of Michigan's aeronautical engineering program, which was the first of its kind at the time. According to Bluth's research, by 1923, Brooks spent his free time around an airstrip located on Grand River and near Orchard Lake, and was eventually employed as a mechanic by pilot and flight instructor Glenn Hoffman. Hoffman also gave Brooks flying lessons, which led the pair on a barnstorming trip, consisting of stunts performed mid-flight. Charles Lindbergh was also doing the same in Minnesota during the same time. A year later, Charles Lindbergh took the more traditional route in becoming a pilot and joined the Army as an aviation cadet in Texas at a field that was ironically named Brooks Field. According to Bluth's research, as there was no flying license requirement at the time, Brooks effectively became a pilot when he soloed on July 4th, 1924. Eager to share his passion for flying, Brooks taught Hoyt Brown, Milton Burrs, and Edna Ferguson all how to fly. Brooks and Ferguson also began a romantic relationship and eventually got engaged, although it's unclear if their romance blossomed prior to flying lessons or as a result of their shared interest in aviation. During this time, Brooks began receiving attention from the press also, as his presence in Oakland County's budding aviation scene grew. For example, the Birmingham Eccentric newspaper reported on September 5th, 1924, that he, Milton Burrs, and Harry Kendall were offering aerial photography, taxi, special stunt services, and the carrying of passengers for pleasure from a field at Southfield and 9 Mile Roads. When interviewed about his new business venture, Brooks humbly stated, "I didn't know how much of my town liked me until I saw how many of them wanted to fly with me." By 1925, Brooks had cemented himself as a skilled flyer in Birmingham and Detroit and had flown himself to Florida, where he did commercial flying. He also helped organize the Michigan Commercial Aviators Association, which aimed to create a passenger air service between the larger towns of Michigan. He also established an aviation field in his name, and on July 3rd, 1925, the Birmingham Eccentric ran a front aerial view of the central business district, shot from a plane piloted by Brooks. However, the media attention he gained then was only a taste of what was to come. Now, Ford is widely known as a pioneer in automobile construction, but less is commonly known about his exploits in aviation. As a shareholder in William B. Stout's Metal Airplane Company, Ford built a factory and flying field for Stout in Dearborn, which was completed in 1924. And on April 19th, 1925, Ford started a company air service between his Dearborn Airport and Chicago's Maywood Airport, using Stout-built planes, hauling freight and company mail. Now, was it fate that Henry Ford came to know Harry Brooks? There are two different accounts about how they met. One is according to Bluth's research, which states that Blanche Brooks told him that Ford visited the Brooks' farm to audition their father, Joseph Brooks, and his band for use at dances at Ford's Phosphor Inn. When Ford noticed an airplane on the farm grounds, he inquired about it. That's when their mother, May Brooks, informed Ford that it belonged to their son, Harry. Because Harry wasn't home at the time, Ford told May to have the boy come see me. However, another story can be found in a newspaper clipping included in a scrapbook we found that was created by a member of one of Brooks's family members that states that Mr. Brooks had been invited to fiddle for an old-time dance Henry Ford was giving in the Botsford Inn. Brooks then fell into conversation with Ford and told him about his flyer son and his ambition to go to the University of Michigan. Ford then told him to send him over to Dearborn and let me have a look at him. Now, despite how their meeting came to be, Ford saw something in Harry, possibly the ambition. Oh. Oh no. Oh, share screen. Oh no, you guys haven't been able to see my wonderfully crafted
Yeah, there you go.
slides.
It should.
I don't want to be whenever I move around the camera.
Oh, yeah, I can move the camera. I can see. Yeah, that's. Sorry about that. Oh, maybe that might help, I think.
Is it catching? Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I'm just showing the screen.
Okay, yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Okay.
Mhm.
Sorry about that, guys. Okay, I'll continue. Where are we? Yeah, because Harry wasn't home at the time, Ford told May to have the boy come see me. Another story can be found in a newspaper clipping included in a scrapbook created by a member of the Brooks family that states Mr. Brooks had been invited to fiddle for an old-time dance Henry Ford was giving in the Botsford Inn. Brooks fell into conversation with Ford and told him of his flyer son and his ambitions to go to the University of Michigan to attend the aeronautical program. Ford then told him to come have him or send him to Dearborn and let me have a look at him. Now, Ford saw something in Harry, possibly the ambition his father spoke of, and at just 22 years old, Harry was personally hired by Ford in August of 1925 to work in the Stout Metal Airplane Division of Ford Motor Company. Brooks was assigned as a rivet puncher for the Stout airplane transport airplane known as the 2AT. But despite his skills, the company required all new pilot hires to begin their journey working on the planes they might fly one day. But Brooks's career would look something different than most. After spending around 3.5 months rivet punching, Brooks was sent to the engine assembly and laboratory departments for 2.5 months before becoming a pilot. Similar to his meeting with Henry Ford, Brooks seemed to be at the right place at the right time with the right amount of skills and determination. There we go. On November 22nd, 1925, William B. Stout completed development on a multi-engine airliner, or the 3AT airplane. Following test flights of the new plane, it was considered a disaster. This disappointed Henry Ford, who'd invested much into Stout and the plane's creation. And on the morning of January 17th, the Ford Airplane Division was enveloped in flames and completely burned down, leaving many, including Brooks, without a place to work. Did Henry Ford hire someone to start the fire to maintain his reputation? Was he embarrassed of the 3AT's disaster? Or was the failure too much for William B. Stout to bear? The answer remains a mystery to this day, but Stout was banished from aircraft development. For Brooks, the loss of his workplace opened up the opportunity to pursue his ultimate goal of becoming a pilot. And according to Blue's research, Brooks applied for his airmail certificate not long after the incident, which he received and made him the youngest of Ford's pilots. As a mail carrier, Brooks flew company routes from Dearborn to Cleveland and Chicago's post office field in Maywood, Illinois. Lindbergh, on a similar timeline as Brooks, made his first airmail run to Maywood on April 26, 1926. The two also seem to have met in Chicago during this time, according to Blue's research. Now, although being an airmail carrier was more reliable and somewhat safer than his earlier days barnstorming around Michigan, flying was still novel and always came with its risks. This became abundantly clear on May 18, 1926, when air mailer and senior Ford pilot Ross Kirkpatrick crashed while attempting to land a 2AT through a storm in Chicago. We'll never know what Brooks's thoughts were about this fatal incident, but it likely served as a reminder for everyone within the airplane division of how dangerous their jobs could be. While the destruction of the Ford Airplane Division surely caused some setbacks, Ford, being the industrious man he was, began a new secret project. At the time, Ford was the leader in car production. He also owned iron, coal, limestone, and lead mines, as well as timberland fields. He also owned a railroad, fleet of ships, a radio station, a newspaper, and a magazine. So the only territory left uncharted was air travel. According to Blue's research, Ford ambitiously assigned Otto Koppen, MIT aeronautical engineering graduate who previously worked at Stout, to design and build a single-seat Ford plane. This plane would become the first Ford Flivver prototype that Brooks would fly. Ford's hope for this new plane was to make air travel as accessible as he'd made traveling by car with the Model T. And further, he might have hoped to find a new specialization, as car companies such as General Motors and Chrysler were now asserting their dominance in the auto industry. As development of the Flivver began, Ford was also working on a bigger airplane factory and assigned a Ford engineer to construct a new tri-motor airplane after the 3AT's failure. Once the Flivver was completed, there was a small issue, however, when it came to testing the plane. According to Blue's research, Brooks's boss, veteran aviator Major Rudolph Schroeder, ironically called Shorty, stood at 6'2", and had previously tested the tri-motor airplane. However, he was unable to test the smaller Flivver due to his height. So Schroeder selected Brooks, who was 5'9", to perform the test. Brooks was successful, and by July 1st of the same year, he received a pay increase, making what would be about $5,400 today per month. Ford also appreciated a good publicity moment and often used his birthday as a day to engage with the press. His 63rd birthday, being no different, was used to formally introduce the Flivver airplane. However, it didn't stop there. On August 7th, 1926, which marked the start of the Ford Air Tour, in which 25 planes flew to 13 Midwestern cities, Ford organized a 10-lap race around the airport between the Flivver and the Drigstart before 30,000 visitors. Brooks easily won the race, which also won him and the Flivver recognition and respect to the press. A month later, Brooks returned to the state fair where he first gotten the aviation bug and displayed the Flivver. Flying in his usual style, Brooks kept low to the ground and raced cars around the track, speeding up at the race's end to win. In the Flivver's last public appearance of 1926, Brooks entertained thousands of visitors who flocked to Ford Field by flying around the 650-foot-long Navy dirigible called the Los Angeles. I'm going to close this so you can actually see. All right. Now, in just 13 months, Brooks made a name for himself, which pleased Henry Ford. And according to Blue's research, this was also when Ford began referring to Brooks as Brooksie, highlighting the soft spot he developed for the young pilot. A few months later, Harry's boss, Major Schroeder, was fired, and senior pilot E.G. Hamilton was put in complete charge of airport operations. Further, in a move that probably shocked Brooks's peers, a memo signed by William B. Mayo, Ford's chief engineer, and head of all aviation activities, assigned Harry to do all test flights. His pay was subsequently increased to what would be around $6,000 per month. Now, by 1927, Detroit was still booming. However, Ford Motor Company was in noticeable decline as sales of the Model T dropped. And on May 26th, the same day, the 15 millionth Model T rolled off the company's assembly line in Highland Park, Michigan, Ford sent a telegram announcing that the Model T would be replaced with an entirely new Ford car. As a result, production of the Model T was completely halted. 1927 was also the same year that Charles Lindbergh set his sights on pursuing the Orteig Prize. Originally offered in 1919 by Raymond Orteig, a French New York City hotel owner, the prize was to be awarded to the first Allied aviator or aviators who flew nonstop from New York to Paris or from Paris to New York. The challenge was attempted by various aviators before, many of whom unfortunately died in the process. However, this didn't deter Charles Lindbergh, who knew he had a chance to successfully complete the journey with an appropriate plane. After searching, he selected the Ryan Aeronautical Company, which was located in San Diego, to construct the Spirit of St. Louis, completed on April of 1927. April was also the same month the Flivver was rebuilt with new wings, a deeper front fuselage, and was eventually powered by a Ford engine. However, Brooks also wanted to be a record of his own, and he set his sights on a record he held by a French aviator, a nonstop flight in a low-power airplane. Similar to Lindbergh, Brooks understood he needed a plane suitable for the journey. However, unlike Lindbergh, Brooks first needed to get approval by Henry Ford, but by early summer of 1927, a new Flivver was in the works. Now, is it a coincidence that Brooks also sought to break a world record of his own not long after Lindbergh? While Brooks might have envied Lindbergh's success, it's unlikely there was competition between them. For instance, by winning the Orteig Prize, Lindbergh had proved to the world that he was the best pilot. But Brooks was in a perfect situation as a young aviator, having the rich industrialist Henry Ford by his side, and both seemed supportive of one another. For example, on a visit to Dearborn, Brooks and Lindbergh gave Henry and Edsel Ford an aerial tour in the trimotor airplane. Then Brooks showed Lindbergh how to fly the Flivver, becoming one of the only people beside Brooks to fly the plane. However, Lindbergh later described the Flivver as one of the worst aircrafts he ever flew. Over the next months, nearly every move Brooks made in the Flivver was covered in the press. Once for winning a Labor Day race with the king of boat racers, Gar Wood, over the Detroit River, then for landing a Ford transport airplane on an 8-mile road to pick up a 100-year-old stagecoach driver who had serviced the Botsford Inn. Once Brooks was brave enough to land the Flivver on Woodward and 11-mile road to speak at the Birmingham Exchange luncheon meeting. Worried he would make it in time, Brooks flew the Flivver, spoke to the club, and then took off from Woodward. According to Blue's research, this move earned him a $400 fine that Henry Ford covered because the incident was free advertising. Not long after, Brooks was in the news again after completing a Dearborn to Chicago journey in less than 5 hours. 5 days after Brooks's 25th birthday, the long-distance Flivver that he requested was complete. The same day, Lindbergh, who became somewhat of an unofficial U.S. ambassador, arrived in Mexico City and sent his mother a telegraph inviting her to spend Christmas with him. Now, Mrs. Lindbergh was a teacher at Cass Tech in Detroit, and with no trains available to return her to Detroit, she initially declined the offer. However, William B. Stout read the dilemma in the Detroit paper and suggested that Mrs. Lindbergh be flown to Mexico City in a Ford trimotor airplane. Henry Ford approved of the plan, and Charles Lindbergh supposedly agreed after learning that Brooks would be the one flying the trimotor. With Harry Brooks as pilot, Harry Russell as co-pilot, and passengers Mrs. Lindbergh, Mr. and Mrs. William B. Stout, and Adrian Lejeune, who was the head of Ford's Mexico operation, the trip kicked off on Monday, December 19th at 10:12 a.m. Throughout the trip, Brooks and Russell faced strong winter winds, rain, and snow, but 4 days and 8 stops later landed safely in Mexico City on December 22nd. Upon arrival, the pair received a personal telegram of congratulations from Edsel Ford. While in Mexico City, Brooks made dozens of flights carrying the president of Mexico, high officials of the Mexican government, and of the Ford Motor Company. And the Trimotor was also the largest plane ever seen in Mexico at the time and gained significant attention from locals and the press. After Christmas, Brooks, Russell, and the passengers departed from Mexico City and faced many challenges. Early aviators only had a magnetic compass in their memory to help navigate throughout the flights. And on December 31st, the party faced heavy headwinds and low visibility. As pilot, Brooks made the decision to go west to Indianapolis without hangars or to Ford Field in Hammond, Indiana on the Chicago-Indiana border. Choosing Hammond, co-pilot Russell spotted a railroad track that ran straight into Hammond. Brooks flew low to keep the track in sight, counting the crossroads and track switches, but he couldn't locate the airport beacon. Instead, he saw an open spot to land, and he successfully landed the plane in waist-deep snow. After exiting the plane, the passengers headed for a building that turned out to be a blind pig. From there, they went to a local hotel for directions, and Brooke and Russells flew the plane to Ford Field, 8 miles from the racetrack. After another emergency landing on New Year's Day, Brooke successfully returned the Trimotor and Mrs. Evangeline to Michigan. Now, for Brooks, this was his first time not being home for Christmas, and he probably missed his family and fiance. However, he received personal congratulations from Henry Ford, considerable press coverage, and was honored by the citizens of Birmingham at a banquet at Oakland Hills Country Club. With nothing being reported in the news, Brooks lived a relatively quiet week after the festivities following his return from Mexico City. However, he probably busied himself by finalizing his intended route for the record-breaking flight from Detroit to Miami, as well as testing the long-range Flivver for the journey. Ford also seemed to be preparing for Brooks's journey, as his secretary, Ernst Jean Leibold, was assigned with telegraphing the 14 Ford dealers along Brooks's intended route to ask for information on possible landing sites and the availability of oil and gas. Brooks might have also used this time to spend with his fiancée. Although not much was publicly known about their relationship, relatives of Edna claimed that Brooks's parents weren't that supportive of their relationship. While I don't know why this was, his parents might have encouraged him to keep it private to focus on his career. After all, Harry aspired to achieve great things, and they didn't want her to distract him. Or maybe they wished for Harry to conceal his relationship to benefit from the perks that appearing as a single, attractive, and an accomplished young man had in the media. Despite their lack of support, Edna's family found a bracelet and other tokens of affection given to her by Harry, signaling a deep connection between the two. On January 24th, 1928, it was go time, and Brooks's plane was set in place. He departed from Dearborn at 7:15 a.m. in snow, rain, and darkness. For the 15-hour flight, Brooks endured harsh temperatures by being in an open cockpit plane without heat, no radio, and only a compass to assist him. Henry Ford is said to have reminded Brooksie that, it is all your idea, and the credit for a successful trip will be all yours. But after unknowingly flying into a huge winter storm and facing continuous adverse weather conditions, he finally accepted defeat, landing in Asheville, North Carolina. Although he didn't achieve his planned goal, Brooks did set a new U.S. record for exceeding 472 miles. However, Brooks faced more challenges attempting to return to Detroit. Soft ground in Asheville, North Carolina, and Spartanburg, South Carolina, led him to Washington, D.C., where the ground was good enough to depart from. Brooks made his final attempt 3 weeks later, on February 21st, 1928. This time he suffered from a cold, but arrived at Ford Airport in the early winter hours in below 4-degree weather with 2 bars of chocolate, a quart bottle of coffee, and an adjustable wrench and a screwdriver. Instead of Henry Ford, Edsel Ford saw Brooks take flight at 6:20 a.m. with an expected arrival time in Miami around 9:20 p.m. About 13 and a half hours later, a gas leak and resulting low fuel, forced him down on a beach near Titusville, Florida. Although the plane's propeller cracked, Brooks walked away unharmed. Despite this incident, however, Brooks still managed to set a new world record, reaching over 950 miles. When interviewed about his early landing, Brooks's confidence seemed unchanged, remarking, "Of course we will try again and make it to Miami." However, the odds continued to be against him as he reportedly spent February 25th and 24th in the Titusville hospital from a throat infection. Unmoved, Brooks was back in action on February 25th to install a new propeller on the Flivver that was sent from Detroit. In the late afternoon, the plane was moved to a clearing on the beach where Brooks finally took off from in Titusville to cover the remaining 180 miles to Miami. There, Henry Ford had been vacationing in his winter home in Fort Myers and waited to greet Brooks upon his arrival. However, Brooks unfortunately would never be seen on land again. Now, I did include a quick warning. There are some images of the wrecked Flivver airplane. There are no bodies in the pictures, but just if you're a sensitive viewer, I just want to give you a heads up. Reports of the crash differ from source to source, but newspapers that cover the incident, a log of events, and Blue's research create a clearer picture. Less than 40 miles down the coast near Melbourne, Florida, witnesses present on the beach reportedly observed a pilot flying low in a weaving plane just above the water. The pilot continued down the beach for a short distance, turned east over the Atlantic as if beginning to circle back for landing. However, the plane nosedived into the ocean. Other reports stated the plane was flying low, or so low that a wave brought it down. Spectators quickly drove to the shore opposite the crash, but the wind blew it out to sea. The Coast Guard was also alerted, and a bonfire was started on the beach to guide them to the crash site. Apparently, when the plane was first seen diving into the ocean, no one knew it was Brooks or one of Ford's planes. A newspaper report stated that the aviator was last seen frantically waving his coat. However, this is unlikely, but by this time it was way too late. There were no boats equipped with a searchlight capable of searching the dark waters. Therefore, the possibility of a rescue became unfeasible. In any case, the Flivver wouldn't be recovered until February 27th, when it washed ashore 18 miles south of Melbourne, Florida, located and loaded onto a Model T truck and taken to a Ford garage. Notes on the wrecked Flivver described the strap as being broken and a large dent in the airspeed indicator. This probably meant that Brooks was either torn loose and killed upon impact or was knocked unconscious. Although we'll never know with certainty what his final moments looks like, for days following the crash, efforts were made to recover his body, but he was never seen again. However, his wallet would later wash ashore, which is shown in the corner of these images, or this slide. On March 2nd, a memorial service organized by all the churches in Melbourne was held on the beach in Florida. 6 days later, Birmingham closed down for a special memorial service that was initially scheduled at the First Methodist Church, but was switched to Birmingham Theater to accommodate the overflow crowd of Ford officials, community leaders, and his friends and family. 3 of the ushers were Hoyt Brown, Milton Burrs, who he had taught to flight, and Harry Kendall, who he previously worked with. A memorial fund was started in Southfield, Michigan, where his family's farm was located, and even Baldwin High School observed 2 minutes of silence in his honor. The cause of the crash remains unknown. However, Blue's research highlights various theories that were made at the time. The first being by L. Esbar, who was a senior official in the Ford Aviation Division at the time. He believed that Brooks died because of gas in the cockpit. However, this was unlikely because Brooks had flown the plane continuously for a long period of time before the crash. Many newspaper reports also speculated that a matchstick or toothpick was placed in a fuel cap vent during repairs made by Brooks to keep water vapor and keep out water vapor and caused a vacuum in the tank, preventing proper fuel flow. However, Ford himself also suspected it had something to do with fuel, believing there was a stoppage of one of the gasoline tanks. He thought that this left Brooks with no time to switch the fuel supply. With speculations of her own, Harry's mother believed his cold caused him to faint mid-flight, yet he didn't have a history of fainting spells prior to that. The last theory was put forth by Harold Hicks, who was a Ford Aircraft Division's chief engineer. And when he saw the wrecked airplane after it returned to Detroit, he discovered that one of the 1/16 inch diameter rudder cables was frayed and had broken. The Flivver's tail wheel was steerable using this rudder cable and put heavy loads on the
Has
cable.
deeply scarred the Jewish people and altered the history.
The last theory was put forth by Harold Hicks, who was a Ford Aircraft Division's chief engineer, like I said. And when he saw the plane after it was returned to Detroit, he discovered that one of the rudder cables was frayed and had broken. The Flivver's tail wheel was steerable using the plane's rudder, but it put heavy loads on the cables while maneuvering on the ground. Now, if one of these cables did break, that would have been consistent with comments made by witnesses who noticed the plane weaving through the air. Despite these theories, however, exactly what caused the crash will never be known. However, as a result, Ford, in his first public comment, announced the company would continue experiments with his Flivver planes and put them into volume production. But this never came to pass. And by 1933, Ford Motor Company's commercial aircraft manufacturing division closed entirely. The decision to stop the development of the Flivver might have been because Ford saw the Flivver as a failure like he did the 3AT, or because it caused the death of a young pilot who'd given his life for the advancement of aviation at his company. In any case, according to Blue's research, Mr. and Mrs. Ford sent a message to Brooks's parents expressing extreme distress over the fate of Harry. After returning to Michigan, Ford also visited the Brooks family farm and with a telegram from a famous naval flyer, Richard E. Byrd, in which she called Brooks one of the greatest pilots in the country. Now, each flight early aviators made contributed to the advancement of aviation. Sometimes this meant pushing the boundaries of flight itself to see how many miles a plane could cover or how fast it could fly. In doing so, some were luckier than others. Some achieved more, like Charles Lindbergh, and others, like Brooks, made the ultimate sacrifice, and unfortunate. While the Flivver Brooks flew was the last of its kind, it represented Ford's aspiration to make the common man or woman a pilot by providing them with a small plane suitable for everyday travel. However, it also stood as a stark reminder of the limitations and dangers of flight and Ford Motor Company's inability to limit those risks. For others, what Brooks left behind was personal. Edna stopped flying and wouldn't marry for about 12 years after his death. As someone who loved aviation, this probably was a tough decision to make. She might have stopped because her life was consumed by that of her marriage and possibly that of her children, or because she never wanted anyone she loved to go through the same pain she experienced after losing Harry. However, one of Edna's Roberta Rowe became a pilot herself in her later years. She remembered her mother taking her to an airport as a child to watch the planes take off and land, something she considered to be romantic. Growing up, she couldn't fight the spark it planted in her young heart, and she eventually became a pilot on her own. And these are some other pictures during Brooks's short career, but some significant achievements nonetheless. And that is the end of my talk. Are there any questions? Yeah, thank you. Of course. Thanks for coming in and listening to it. Let's see. Could probably end this unless there are questions in the chat. Do you know how long his distance record stood? I don't know. That's a great question. I don't have that information right now. Was it applied? Do you show the slides we missed in the chat? Yes, I can. Let me see. I think it was like the very beginning, so. So this is my opening slide. yeah, I'll let you look at this for a few seconds and I'll continue to the other ones. And on the side there, the Ford Flivver, that is some say the third, but might have been also the fourth prototype. But the last Flivver that Brooks flew was number 3218. And I think another one had another number. We'll go down. This was my early life slide. And the corner is Brooks's parents, his mom and dad, and then that is Brooks in the corner and bottom corner, in high school. It was taken from one of the Baldwinian yearbooks. And then the house that was on their farm is the big red house that you see in the center. And then this was the slide explaining World War or the Second World War One and how that sort of affected aircraft production at that time. And then this is of the Baldwin High School in the back, and then the varsity football team that Harry was captain of, and then another picture of Harry when he was in high school. And then I think you guys saw these slides, if I'm not mistaken. But I'll just explain. In the corner, the bottom right corner, that is Harry Brooks, and then Edna Ferguson, and then Charles Lindbergh, and then the picture that was included in the eccentric newspaper. Let me see if there are any more questions. Yes, the blind pig was in reference to establishments that sold alcohol at the time. And okay, yeah, you didn't see them. Yeah. Yeah, I think you guys definitely saw this one though. So yeah, the Stoutmeadow Airplane Company before it was set aflame, and then Harry Brooks sitting in front of a trimotor, and then the 2AT and the right corner.
Sorry if I missed this as part of your introduction, but
Yeah.
how did you come to this topic, or how did this strike your interest?
Yeah, so it was pretty cool because this collection was in the collection was already in our collection. And then but it hadn't really been looked through yet in a session or properly a session. So I was given the task along with an intern at the museum at the time. And so we basically spent a month accessioning everything and going through all the documents, images, and there were 2 scrapbooks and things like that. So from there, we sort of were able to piece the story together, but also in the beginning, I mentioned John Bluth, who was originally planning to write a book on Brooks's life. And so that's how the collection came to the museum. And it was basically a compilation of all the different research materials that he was using to write the book. So it's definitely pretty cool. And like I said in the beginning, if you are interested and you have any more questions, or if you want to see it yourself, you can access the collection by contacting the museum. So either by phone or through email. Cool. Yeah. I see some more chats in here. Okay, yeah, that's all. So thank you guys for coming in, and I'm sorry for the hiccups in the beginning, but yeah, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, that was very cool. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks.
It's great.
Bye.